We have been asked to keep our remarks short, and I will. But if I may beg the indulgence of my fellow panelists for 30 seconds, I'd like to start by saying how much of a pleasure it is for me to be here in Delhi with you all today. This city was home for me for about a decade, back in my formative years. और 10 साल दिल्ली में रहने के बाद मैंने थोड़ी बहुत हिंदी बोलनी भी सीखी है, जैसे आप देख रहे हो या सुन रहे हो. इसलिए आजकल जब भी इंडिया आने का मौका मिलता है मुझे, और ख़ास करके दिल्ली आने का, तो दिल खुश हो जाता है. इस पैनल के बाद आप सबसे हिंदी बोलने के लिए मैं तैयार हूँ, लेकिन अभी के लिए अगर आप इजाज़त दोगे तो मैं फिर से वापस अंग्रेज़ी में बोलना शुरू करूँगा. धन्यवाद. Well, thank you. This was all part of the applause therapy session we had before this panel began. I have a couple of things that I wanted to say, but so much of them have already been said by the panelists before me that I'm going to have to think on my feet here, which is why I stood up instead of sitting down, and instead kind of try and build on what's already been said rather than just repeating it. I recognize that some of the previous sessions so far have alluded to, if not outright pointed out, the tension between the corporate side of things and sort of business's role when it comes to sustainability and social responsibility, and that of the standards that have been set by multilateral organizations or governments. And that is a real tension. I don't think that that is in dispute. However, what is becoming increasingly clear is that that tension is not so much one of incongruity of goals, a mutual exclusivity of goals, as much as it is about a sense of paths towards achieving them, and possibly also where one places the responsibility for achieving them. This panel has been tasked, in particular, with talking about the role and the value of voluntary standards and how they can be incorporated into the larger conversation, and also, of course, what that means specifically for India, which I will try and touch upon towards the end of my remarks. But what I would submit is that by raising the question in that way, we are perhaps sending an incorrect signal with regards to these private standards by suggesting that they stand apart from government, that they stand apart from what the path currently towards achieving sustainability is. And to the extent that a voluntary standard by definition is not a regulatory one, then perhaps that is not an inaccurate depiction of where things are. But to the extent that what we're trying to say is how do we get ourselves from the state of affairs we're in right now to a more sustainable one, then I would submit that that distinction is one without a difference, because the end goals are quite the same. Now, one of the challenges that we face, regardless of what goal it is we're trying to achieve, whether it's a government trying to enforce public policy or a private enterprise in making a profit, is that, as with all things, resources are limited and our desires outnumber our ability to deliver all of them. So how best to utilize resources is ultimately what the question boils down to. And it is in that regard that I'd probably pick up my substantive remarks, launching off from a point that Jason made earlier, which is that neither governments nor voluntary standards nor business enterprises by themselves are going to be able to achieve these goals that we've set out for ourselves. And by these goals, I am referring broadly to the bucket of goals, not necessarily just the SDGs, but perhaps an organization's own corporate code or a RAP's mission to foster social responsibility in its own product sector. So what then is the role of voluntary standards, and what is the best way for them to be incorporated into the larger public policy discussion? And then what does that mean for India in particular? Well, voluntary standards have evolved in a variety of settings, and several of my co-panelists have already alluded to them. I am personally most familiar with the evolution in the apparel sector, which I would submit is probably the largest sort of case study out there for this, which makes sense given that apparel is by far the most labor-intensive industry out there, and therefore the most high impact when it comes to human rights and workers' rights. And in that arena, we've heard about some of the challenges, and we've heard about some of the recent tragedies, and of course we acknowledge, as Abu did at the end of his speech, that there is still much work to be done. But let us not confuse the fact that we have not yet gotten to where we want to with the belief that we haven't achieved anything. I would submit that that is patently false, and as somebody who's closely observed this industry for well over a decade now, I can tell you unequivocally that things are much better today than they were in the mid-90s or the mid-2000s. Is there more to do? Of course there is. But improvement has been made, and so one of the biggest roles of these private standards has been as a real agent of change, driving improvement in all industries. As I said, I know mostly about the apparel sector, which is where RAP is the single largest private certification program, factory-based. But I don't want to talk to you about my organization. If you are interested in learning more about it, I'd be happy to discuss it after the fact. And my colleague, Mr. Kirti Ramakrishnan, is sitting right here. He heads our operations in India, so please see him about those things. The point I'm trying to make is that in reality, so much of the progress that this industry has been able to achieve over the past decade has come as a result of the good work being done by the business sector through voluntary standards. Now, we may argue that some of that is self-serving. Jason again alluded to the fact that one driver for the establishment of such standards and groups such as his and mine is as an attempt to ward off regulatory changes on the part of governments, whether in Europe or the United States or even right here in India. But the fact is that, as we all know, governments alone, even if they were to promulgate regulation, would never have the necessary resources to enforce those regulations in every single case where they may apply. There is just no way for the Ministry of Labor to hire enough inspectors to visit all the factory sites in any given industry to be able to actually make sure that these codes are being met. So it's not feasible. I mean, I'm not talking about just India here. The United States, which we see as a more resource-rich country, cannot possibly afford all the labor inspectors needed to inspect all the factories, however few there are left, in the United States itself. So you have to have an alternative mechanism for making sure that that is achieved. And the most effective way of doing that is to look upon business and recognize that it is in their own self-interest to make sure that the factories that they source from, the vendor base that they have, is in compliance with these regulations. And the way for them to do that is through the enforcement of these private voluntary standards like RAP. This is an incredibly important point to note, because for all those of you who recognize the need to do more and lament business's role or lament government's role, you cannot ignore the fact that you have to have these resources in place, because it's not going to be possible for government to do it alone. So, the role of voluntary standards and kind of how they intertwine with the regulatory and policy framework kind of comes together in that last remark, and I will end with just a couple of points about what this means for India. And quite frankly, I don't want to overstate my case by saying that what I'm talking about is only India-specific. What this means for India is the same thing it means for any country. Less than 18 hours ago, I was in Vietnam. I got here at 2:30 in the morning, and that's another reason why I'm standing. I'm afraid I might fall asleep if I sit there. And I made the same point there that I'm going to make over here. And this is a point that was made in the previous panel, most notably by Roel, but also echoed by Shankar, which is that the business case for sustainability, the business case for social responsibility, is clear and getting even more specific day by day. It is no longer simply a business case based on risk mitigation. You have to do this, otherwise bad things will happen and your reputation will be ruined and you won't be able to sell your stuff. That remains a strong motivation. But it's also a business case in the positive sense, which is you do this to make your company more profitable, your workers more productive, more efficient, and thereby actually improve business directly as opposed to protect business from bad things and help indirectly. So that business case is real, it's strong, it's getting stronger every day, and that, as I said, is the message when it comes to answering what does it mean for India, but the message for what does it mean for anywhere in the world. So, in conclusion, the business case is there, it's real, it's strong, getting stronger. The importance of voluntary programs cannot be overstated because governments never will be able to have the resources to implement these standards alone by themselves. And with business interests becoming clearer, it now aligns even better. Because the other challenge, and I will end on this note, I think Ruchira is getting a little anxious over here, is that the big problem with a regulatory approach is two problems, actually. One is that no matter how well-intentioned, however well-researched, however well-planned, you can never, in passing a law, imagine every possible scenario in which it might apply. And so you set yourself up to failure in one of two paths: unintended consequences, capturing situations that were never intended to be covered by the law, or missing out on situations that might apply and you didn't craft the law accurately enough to get them. So that's one problem with regulation. The other problem with regulation is necessarily, if you have a law, you have to enforce it, which means you have to set up a mechanism to find the bad guys, a mechanism to prosecute them, a mechanism to put them to justice, all that good stuff. So those two are expensive propositions. On the flip side, if you have a voluntary approach, the beauty of the business case is that once you can make it clear that this is good for business, then they will do it because it is good for business. Not because they have to by law, but because they want to. And when you have that situation, you don't have to worry about enforcement because they're doing it anyway. And you don't have to worry about crafting it narrowly enough or widely enough to cover everything because things will naturally flow because of business interests. And on that note, I will say thank you to all of you once again, and I look forward to the rest of the conversation.